The lost Wildeth evening sky over San Francisco was painted with soft orange and gray. Sundar Pichai walked alone down a quiet street after a long day at Google headquarters. He held his phone to his ear, listening to a colleague's voice. He was distracted, his mind full of meetings and deadlines. In his other hand was his wallet, but he didn't notice it slowly slipping from his fingers as he adjusted his coat. Behind him, a man sitting by a lamppost noticed. He was wrapped in a thin blanket, his face hidden under a hood. His hands were rough and dirty from months of living on the streets. His name was Eli. People passed by him all day and all night, never looking at him, never speaking. But he saw everything. He noticed Sundar's wallet fall to the ground, and he heard the man's footsteps fade as he walked away. Eli slowly crawled forward, picked up the wallet, and opened it just enough to see a few credit cards, some cash, and a driver's license. The name printed there made his eyes widen. He knew that name from the news, from stories about technology and success. But right now, Sundar Pichai was just a man who had dropped his wallet. Eli could feel the weight of the wallet in his palm. He thought about the last time he had held so much money. It was years ago. His stomach growled, and his body was cold and tired. He could just take it, he thought. No one would know. No one would care. But something inside him refused. He stood up, legs shaking, and started walking quickly down the street in the direction Sundar had gone. Sundar was gone. Eli walked faster, then ran. He called out, his voice hoarse and weak. But no one turned around. He felt panic rising in his chest. He stopped under another streetlight and sank to his knees, breathing hard. The wallet felt heavier now. But then, he heard soft footsteps behind him. "Are you okay?" a kind voice asked. It was a woman walking her dog. She looked at him nervously. Eli tried to speak but couldn't find the words. He clutched the wallet tightly and shook his head. The woman stayed for a moment but then walked away, leaving him in the shadows. Eli sat there for a long time. The sky grew darker and the street grew emptier. Finally, he opened the wallet fully and looked at the address on the driver's license. It was a mansion, high on a hill, far from here. He didn't even have bus fare. He made up his mind he would walk. That night, while most of the city slept, Eli started walking uphill, clutching Sundar's wallet. Every few blocks he stopped to rest, leaning on walls, shivering in the cold around. Midnight, a car pulled up beside him. A man in a suit rolled down the window and stared at him. "You lost?" the man asked sharply. Eli shook his head and kept walking. The man frowned, muttered something under his breath, and drove away. Eli felt shame burning in his chest. He was dirty. He probably smelled. And yet, here he was carrying the wallet of one of the most powerful men in the world. Hours passed. At one point, he sat on the curb, exhausted, and thought about giving up. But then he remembered the look in Sundar's eyes as he walked by earlier. Sundar hadn't even seen him. Not because he didn't care, but because he hadn't noticed. No one ever noticed. By dawn, Eli finally reached the gates of a huge house. His feet hurt so badly, he could barely stand. The driveway was long and quiet. He slipped through the gate and limped up to the door. He pressed the bell. Nothing. He pressed it again. After what felt like forever, the door opened. A tall man in a crisp shirt looked at Eli with suspicion. "Yes?" the man asked coldly. Eli held out the wallet with both hands. "He dropped this," Eli said softly. "On the street." The man's eyes narrowed. He took the wallet and looked down at it, then back up at Eli. Before Eli could explain, another voice came from behind the man. "What's going on?" It was Sundar. He looked tired, still in his pajamas, but when his eyes landed on the wallet, and then on Eli, something shifted in his expression. You brought this back?" Sundar asked quietly. Eli nodded, too exhausted to speak. Sundar stared at him for a long time, then stepped outside. The cold air wrapped around them both. "What's your name?" Sundar asked gently. "Eli," he whispered. Then Sundar smiled slightly, though his eyes looked troubled. "Eli," he said. "Thank you, really." But just then, before Eli could answer, there was a loud crash from behind them. Both of them turned to see a dark car speeding toward the gate, its headlights blinding, its tires screeching. Sundar instinctively grabbed Eli's arm and pulled him aside as the car skidded to a stop just inches away. The driver jumped out, shouting, "What are you doing here?" the man barked. Sundar looked confused. Eli felt his stomach drop. The man advanced, pointing at Eli. "You think you can just show up here? You think he'll help you? He doesn't know who you are." Eli backed away slowly, fear in his eyes. Sundar raised his hand to stop the man, but it was too late. The man lunged forward and grabbed Eli's coat, shoving him back toward the street. "Get out of here," the man snarled. "Go back to where you came from." Eli stumbled and fell hard on the pavement. The world spun. Sundar stood frozen for a moment, then finally shouted, "Stop." The man froze, his grip still on Eli's coat. Sundar's voice was low but sharp. "Let him go." The man hesitated, then released Eli roughly and stepped back. Eli sat there, breathing hard, feeling small and broken. Sundar knelt down beside him, his face filled with something Eli didn't understand. Sorrow. anger, maybe regret. But before Sundar could speak, the driver of the dark car spoke again, his voice dripping with contempt. He's nothing, the man sneered. Don't waste your time. Eli felt those words cut deeper than the cold. He looked up at Sundar, who was still staring at him, his jaw tight. Then Sundar said something that made the driver go silent. Everyone is something, Sundar said softly. And you don't get to decide who matters. The driver flinched but didn't reply. Eli tried to stand, but his legs were too weak. Sundar reached out his hand. Come inside, Sundar said. Eli stared at him in shock, but just as Sundar helped Eli to his feet, the driver spoke again, his voice dark and mocking. You're making a mistake, the man hissed. He's not who you think he is. Eli's heart pounded. Sundar frowned at the driver, then turned to Eli. What does he mean? Sundar asked quietly. Eli opened his mouth to answer, but before he could say a word, the driver stepped closer and dropped a folded piece of paper at Sundar's feet. Ask him about this, the man said coldly. Then the driver climbed back into the dark car and sped away, leaving a trail of dust and silence behind. Sundar slowly bent down and picked up the paper, his eyes scanning it. As he read, his face changed, first confusion, then surprise, then something else. He looked back at Eli, who stood trembling in the dawn light. Eli, Sundar said quietly, holding up the paper. Is this true? Eli's eyes filled with tears, but he couldn't answer. Sundar's jaw tightened. He folded the paper slowly, slipping it into his pocket. Come inside, he said again, but this time his voice was heavier, colder. And Eli, feeling both hope and dread twisting in his chest, followed Sundar through the door. As the door closed behind them, the sun rose over the hills, casting a golden light over the house and the quiet street below. But inside, the air was thick with silence and unanswered questions. The truth in the Paperthy door shut softly behind them, and for a moment Eli felt like the air inside the house was too thick to breathe. It smelled faintly of wood polish and fresh coffee, but there was a sharp edge to the silence. Sundar walked slowly ahead of him, his bare feet making almost no sound on the smooth wooden floor. The hallway stretched long and warm, lined with quiet paintings and family photographs. Yet it felt to Eli like a tunnel that was narrowing with every step. Eli's eyes flicked toward the folded paper still in Sundar's hand. The driver's last words clung to his mind like cold chains. Ask him about this. They entered a spacious kitchen, glowing with morning light. The windows overlooked a garden where flowers danced gently in the breeze, oblivious to the tension in the room. Sundar turned to Eli and gestured toward a chair at the kitchen table. He said softly. Eli obeyed, lowering himself onto the chair as though it might break under the weight of his shame. His coat was still damp from the night air. He clasped his hands tightly in his lap, staring at the grain of the wooden table, afraid to meet Sundar's eyes. For a long time, Sundar said nothing. He set the wallet down on the table and stood by the counter, staring at the paper. His face was unreadable, but the silence between them grew heavy and sharp. Finally, Sundar spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a question hiding beneath it. Do you know what's written here? He asked. Eli's throat felt dry, and he swallowed hard before answering. Yes, he whispered. Then, tell me, Sundar said, unfolding the paper and laying it flat on the table between them. Eli glanced at it briefly. He knew every word by heart already, though the sight of it still made his stomach twist. The paper was yellowed, creased, but the black letters were clear enough. It was an old newspaper clipping. A photograph of Eli's face, younger, cleaner, but unmistakable, stared back at him above a headline that screamed louder than he ever could. Local banker, charged with fraud and charity scandal. Eli closed his eyes. He could still remember that day like it was yesterday. The reporters shouting his name as they chased him down the courthouse steps. The flash of cameras, the sting of his wife's silence as she turned away from him, and the faces of the children from the charity he was supposed to have helped, standing in the crowd, watching him with confusion and disappointment. I didn't take the money, Eli said quietly, without opening his eyes. But no one believed me. Sundar pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, his elbows resting on the table. His eyes were sharp, but not cruel. He waited, as though he could tell there was more. Eli drew a shaky breath and continued. My boss, he easted me up. I found out about things he was doing. He told me to keep quiet, but I didn't. I went to the police, or at least I tried. His voice broke a little, but he kept going. Next thing I knew, they found money in my account, documents, with my signature. I still don't know how he did it all, but he was smart and powerful, and no one listened to me. He opened his eyes finally and looked up at Sundar, who was still silent. I lost everything, Eli said. My job, my house, my family, my name, everything. The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Sundar leaned back in his chair and studied Eli for a long moment. There was no anger in his expression, just something heavier, harder to name. Why didn't you fight it? Sundar asked finally. Eli let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. You think I didn't? He shook his head. You don't understand. Once people believe something about you, it doesn't matter what's true anymore. Every lawyer I hired told me to take a deal. Plead guilty. I said no. But even then, I couldn't win. He paused, and his voice dropped so low it was almost a whisper. After a while, I stopped trying. The words hung in the air. Sundar looked down at the paper, then back at Eli. His fingers drummed softly on the table as though he was thinking deeply. Why? Sundar said slowly. If you really lost everything, if you really hate the world that much, why didn't you keep my wallet? Eli's hands tightened in his lap. He looked down again and spoke quietly. Because that's not who I am. Not really. Not yet. Something flickered in Sundar's eyes at that answer. He nodded slightly, though he didn't say anything right away. Then he stood up and poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher. He set one in front of Eli, who accepted it with trembling hands. Sundar sat back down and took a long sip before speaking again. The man in the car, Sundar said, do you know him? Eli shook his head. No, but I know his kind. What do you mean? Eli hesitated. Then he said, the kind of person who thinks people like me are invisible, who thinks people like me don't deserve another chance. Sundar studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. But you still came here. Yes, Eli said, even knowing what I'd find in this paper. Eli nodded once, though his chest felt tight. Yes, Sundar was quiet again. Then he stood, abruptly, and walked toward the window. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the garden. Eli watched him, unsure if he should speak or stay silent. Finally, Sundar turned back, his face unreadable. I believe you, he said simply. Eli froze. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Eli's voice faltered. You believe me? Yes. Sundar said, I've met enough people to know when someone is lying. And you're not. Eli felt something hot and sharp behind his eyes. He looked down, gripping the glass of water tightly to steady himself. Thank you, Eli whispered. Sundar came back to the table and sat down again. But, he added, believing you doesn't mean I can fix what happened. I can't change the past. And I don't know yet if I can change your future. Eli nodded faintly. He hadn't expected anything more than this moment. Just being believed was already more than he thought he'd ever get again. But then Sundar leaned forward, his voice softer now. What I can offer, he said, is a chance. Eli's head snapped up. A chance, he repeated. Yes, Sundar said, to prove who you really are. To yourself and to everyone else. Eli swallowed hard, unable to find the right words. Sundar's eyes were steady on his dot, but before either of them could say more, a sharp sound shattered the quiet. A knock at the door. Sundar frowned and stood, walking toward the entryway. Eli stayed frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The knock came again, louder this time, when Sundar opened the door. The morning light spilled in, along with 2 men in dark suits, their expressions serious. One of them held up a badge. Mr. Pichai, the man said coolly. We need to speak with you. It's about him. Both men's eyes shifted past Sundar to where Eli sat in the kitchen. Eli felt his stomach drop as the men stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The taller man leaned slightly toward Sundar and lowered his voice, just enough that Eli could barely hear. You don't know who you've let into your home. Sundar's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He glanced back at Eli, whose face had gone pale. The second man opened a black folder and placed a single photograph on the table in front of Eli. Care to explain this? The man asked coldly. Eli looked down at the photo and felt his heart stop. It wasn't the old newspaper clipping, that it was something much worse. And as his eyes widened, and the room seemed to close in around him, he heard the taller man say 5 words that chilled him to the bone. You've run out of chances. Asterisk, the photograph. Eli stared at the photograph on the table as if it were a snake about to strike. His breath caught in his throat. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. It was him, standing in an alley at night. His hood pulled low over his face, his hands outstretched as though taking something from another man. The other figure in the photo was shadowed and indistinct, but their posture suggested urgency. Beneath the photo, a date and time were printed clearly just 2 weeks ago. The taller of the 2 men stood behind him now, his shadow falling long across the kitchen floor. We've been looking for you since that night, the man said, his tone sharp and unyielding. You thought you could just vanish. But people don't vanish. Mr. Eli. Sundar stood silent by the counter, his eyes flicking between the photo and Eli, his face unreadable. Eli swallowed hard, forcing words out of his dry mouth. That's not what it looks like, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The second man, who still stood by the table, leaned forward, his fingers lightly tapping the photo. Then explain it, he said coldly. We're listening. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. When he opened them, they glistened with something between fear and defiance. That night, he began slowly, I was trying to stop something. Not do it. The men exchanged a look. A silent, skeptical message passed between them like smoke. Sundar stayed quiet, but he moved closer now, his eyes fixed on Eli. Go on. Sundar said gently. Eli let out a shaky breath. I sleep in an alley sometimes, he admitted, a quiet one near the river. That night, I heard shouting. Two men, one of them was hurting the other. I didn't see much, just enough to know it was bad. The smaller guy fell down and dropped something, a bag, I think. The bigger one ran off when he saw me. I didn't take the bag. I tried to help the other guy, but his voice faltered, and he shook his head. The taller man cut in, his voice sharp. But you were seen holding the bag. Yes, Eli admitted. Just for a second, I was trying to give it back to him, but when he saw me, he screamed and ran. He thought I was with the other guy. The second man folded his arms, his expression skeptical. Convenient story. Eli looked up at him then, his eyes flashing for the first time with something other than shame. It's not a story, he said firmly. It's what happened. The kitchen went quiet again. The clock ticked on the wall. Sundar's gaze remained steady on Eli, but now there was a question in his eyes. The taller man finally spoke again. The victim never came forward, but the bag contained stolen property. Expensive jewelry. We have witnesses who say you ran. From the scene, Eli shook his head. I didn't run, he said quietly. The victim did. The second man opened his mouth to respond, but Sundar raised a hand, stopping him. What happened to the bag? Sundar asked calmly. Eli looked down at his hands. I left it there, he said, on the ground. I didn't want anything to do with it. The taller man let out a dry laugh. How convenient, he muttered. You expect us to believe that? Eli looked up again, his voice quiet but steady. Believe whatever you want. That's the truth. The two men exchanged another glance. Then the second man reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. He slid it across the table towards Sundar. If you decide he's not your problem, call us, he said curtly. He still has questions to answer. The taller man added, You're making a mistake, Mr. Pitt. You don't know who this man is. Sundar took the card without looking at it. His eyes stayed on Eli as the two men walked out, their footsteps echoing down the hall. The front door closed with a heavy finality, and silence settled over the kitchen again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sundar stood by the counter, his fingers drumming against the edge, as though weighing something in his mind. Eli sat rigid in his chair, staring at the photograph that still lay between them. It felt like a mirror now, reflecting back everything he wished he could forget. Finally, Sundar spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Why didn't you tell me? Eli shook his head helplessly. I thought, it didn't matter anymore. I thought if I told you, you'd think I was just another liar. Like everyone else. Sundar leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp now. And yet, you brought my wallet back, because Eli said, his voice breaking, that's not who I am. The words hung in the air like smoke, curling into the quiet corners of the kitchen. Sundar studied him for a long time, then nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, softly, you just forgot who you are. Eli felt his chest tighten at that. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Sundar stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the garden again. The sun was higher now, spilling golden light across the flowers, but the air between them stayed heavy and uncertain. Then, without turning around, Sundar said, You should clean up. Eli blinked. What? Sundar turned, his expression calm but unreadable. Shower, change your clothes. I'll have something brought for you. You can't keep telling people who you are when you look like you've already given up. Eli sat frozen for a moment, then nodded faintly. Thank you, he whispered. Sundar led him down a long hallway to a guest room at the far end. The room was simple but warm, with a small bed and a private bathroom. A fresh set of clothes lay folded on the dresser. Sundar paused at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame. We'll talk more after, Sundar said, but remember this. If you lie to me again, even once, I won't be able to help you. Eli nodded. I understand. Sundar's gaze softened for just a second before he turned and walked away, leaving Eli alone. The sound of running water filled the small bathroom as Eli stood under the shower, feeling the heat wash months of dirt and cold from his skin. He watched the water swirl dark and murky at his feet until it finally ran clear. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt almost human. When he emerged, clean and dressed in the new clothes, the house seemed quieter somehow. The kitchen was empty, a faint smell of coffee and bread lingered, but Sundar was nowhere to be seen. Eli walked down the hallway slowly, unsure whether he should stay or leave. He turned a corner and stopped. The front door was open, and outside, in the driveway, Sundar stood facing another man. This man was unfamiliar, tall and lean, dressed in an immaculate suit with a cruel smile on his lips. The two of them stood close, their voices low but tense. Eli stepped closer, staying hidden behind the corner. He could just make out the man's words now. You don't know what you're doing, the man said, his tone smooth but sharp. He's not worth it. Sundar's reply was quiet but firm. Everyone is worth something. The suited man let out a dry laugh. You think this is about kindness? No, it's about power. And he The man's voice dropped even lower now, almost a whisper. He knows things you shouldn't know. Sundar stiffened slightly. What are you talking about? The man leaned closer, his smile widening. Ask him about the girl, he said softly. Ask him what happened to her. Eli's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a stone to the chest. Before Sundar could answer, the man straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. You think you're saving him, the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. But the truth is, he's the reason she's gone. The man turned and walked back to his car, his shoes clicking sharply on the stone driveway. Sundar stood frozen for a long moment before slowly turning back toward the house. Eli ducked back around the corner, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. The girl. The words echoed in his head, louder and louder, until they were all he could hear as Sundar stepped back into the house. His eyes fell on Eli standing there, pale and silent. Their eyes met, and Sundar spoke just 2 words, his voice low and heavy. Tell me, the girl's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Tell me. Sundar's eyes stayed locked on Eli, and there was something in them that made Eli feel colder than the night he'd walked through to bring back the wallet. He stood frozen at the corner of the hallway, his back against the wall, as though it could somehow swallow him whole. Tell you what, Eli said finally, though his voice cracked as he spoke. Sundar stepped closer, his footsteps quiet but firm. On the polished floor, about the girl, he said evenly. The one that man mentioned. Eli's throat tightened, his knees felt weak. He lowered his gaze to the floor, to anything but Sundar's steady eyes. You don't understand, Eli murmured. Then help me understand, Sundar replied, his voice softer now, but still heavy with something Eli couldn't quite name. Expectation, maybe, or disappointment. Eli rubbed his hands together, feeling the warmth of the new clothes Sundar had given him, and yet he still felt cold. It's not what you think, he whispered. Sundar's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice stayed calm. Then what is it? Eli stayed quiet, struggling to find the words. The memory of her face rose in his mind unbidden, sharper than glass, cutting through him. He remembered her smile, the way she laughed like she didn't know the world could hurt her. The way she looked at him like he was still someone worth believing in. Her name was Clara. He finally spoke her name aloud, and it came out as a whisper. Clara. And Dar frowned faintly, but he stayed silent, giving Eli space to continue. Eli let out a shaky breath. She was the only person who believed me, he said quietly. Back then, after the first scandal, when everyone turned away, she didn't. She stayed. She helped me survive when I thought I couldn't. The words spilled out slowly, like water from a cracked dam. Eli sat down heavily on the nearest chair, staring at his hands. We met at a shelter. She volunteered there. Brought food, blankets. She talked to me like I was still human. After months of silence from everyone else, she was light. He paused, his throat dry. Sundar listened carefully, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. We became friends, Eli continued. And then more than that. She gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, I could start over. But then, his voice caught, and he swallowed hard. She got caught up in something she didn't understand. Something I should have stopped. Eli's eyes glistened now, but he didn't wipe the tears away. The same man who set me up. He was using the shelter, laundering money through it, hurting people, Clara found out. She thought she could expose him. She came to me, asked for my help. I told her to leave it alone. I begged her to. He let out a bitter laugh, though there was no joy in it. But she wouldn't listen. She believed people would do the right thing if they just knew the truth. He closed his eyes, seeing her face again. The last time he saw her. The next day she was gone. No one saw her again. The silence that followed felt heavier than words. Sundar finally moved closer, pulling out a chair opposite Eli and sitting down slowly. And you, Sundar asked gently, what did you do? Eli shook his head, his voice breaking. I searched. I went to the police. They laughed at me, said it was my fault, said maybe I wanted her gone. I tried everything. But she was just gone and I broke. The clock on the wall ticked softly, filling the quiet space between them. Sundar sat back, his eyes dark with thought. Why didn't you tell anyone what really happened? He asked after a long moment. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he answered. Because no one listens to people like me anymore. Sundar stayed quiet for a while, his eyes fixed on Eli as though he were trying to see something beyond the words. Then he stood and walked over to the window again. Outside, the garden was bright and alive, but neither man seemed to notice. Thought finally, Sundar spoke, his voice low and careful. Do you still believe she's alive? Eli froze. The question sank deep into him. After a long pause, he whispered, I have to. Sundar nodded slightly, but didn't look back at him. Then we find her, he said simply. Eli's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What, he breathed? We find her? Sundar repeated. If she's out there, we find her? But if we do this, I need you to tell me everything. No more secrets. Eli stared at him, his chest tight, but finally he nodded. Everything, he said hoarsely. Sundar finally turned back to him, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. Good, he said, then we start now. But before Eli could respond, the sharp ring of Sundar's phone cut through the quiet. Sundar frowned, pulling it from his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened instantly. He answered, "Yes." A muffled voice on the other end spoke quickly, and Sundar's jaw tightened with every word. After a long moment, he replied simply, "I understand," and hung up. Eli watched him carefully. Sensing something had changed, Sundar slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at Eli, his face suddenly grim. "We have a problem," he said. "What kind of problem?" Eli asked, his voice wary. Sundar's eyes stayed on him, unblinking. "The man in the car. He's not working. Alone." Eli's stomach sank. "I figured." "No," Sundar said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You don't understand. He works for someone higher. Someone who already knows you're here." Eli felt the blood drain from his face. "Who?" he asked. Sundar paused, his gaze steady. "The same man who destroyed you before." The room seemed to shrink around them then, the walls pressing closer. Eli's hands tightened into fists in his lap. "He's coming," Sundar added, his voice low. Tonight Eli's breath caught in his chest. "What does he want?" Sundar's eyes narrowed slightly. "You, and whatever you're still hiding." Eli's mind raced. "Then what do we do?" Sundar looked at him for a long moment, then turned toward the window. The sun was already beginning its descent, shadows stretching across the garden. "We don't wait for him," Sundar said softly. He turned back, his eyes sharp now, full of determination. "We go to him." The words hung between them like a dare, full of weight and danger. Eli stared at Sundar, his heart pounding, his hands trembling slightly. "Are you sure?" Eli asked finally, his voice small. Sundar gave the faintest nod, his gaze unwavering. "He wants you to run," he said, "so we don't." Just then, the sound of tires crunching on the driveway shattered the tense quiet. Both men froze, their eyes locking. Eli's breath hitched as he heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. And then a voice, smooth, mocking, and terrifyingly close, floated in through the open window. "You really thought you could hide from me?" Eli felt his stomach twist as the color drained from his face. He knew that voice. Even after all these years, he knew. The door handle rattled once, twice, and then it began to turn. The Visitor's door handle turned slowly, and every second of its movement stretched like a lifetime in Eli's chest. He could hear his own heartbeat, now, thudding in his ears as the air in the room grew heavy and sharp. Sundar moved first, quiet, controlled, stepping toward the door with a calmness that didn't quite reach his eyes. But Eli stayed frozen where he stood, his hands gripping the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles went white. The door swung open, and there he was, the man who had destroyed everything. He looked older now, but not by much. His dark hair was neatly combed, his tailored suit flawless, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as he stepped inside like he owned the place. His eyes, cold, gray, and calculating, swept the room, landing on Eli with an expression that could cut steel, while the man said softly, his lips curling into a faint smile, "Look at you." Eli felt the room tilt slightly, his legs almost giving way beneath him. The last time he'd seen this man, it had been in a courtroom, and those same eyes had watched him burn without flinching. Sundar stood his ground, his expression calm but "You weren't invited," he said evenly. The man's gaze flicked to Sundar, his smile sharpening. "Do I need an invitation to clean up my own mess?" he asked. Then he looked back at Eli. "You've been busy," he added, his tone light, but laced with menace, wandering around, telling stories, pretending you still matter. Eli's hands tightened on the table. He forced himself to meet the man's gaze. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The man chuckled softly, stepping farther into the room. "What I've always wanted," he said, "but the same thing I told you all those years ago." Silence. Eli felt his stomach twist. He remembered the first time he'd heard that word from this man's lips, whispered like a curse in a parking garage, the night before the charity scandal broke. Silence, or everything you care about will disappear. And he had stayed silent, for a while, until Clara died at the thought of her. Something inside him cracked. He straightened slightly, his shoulders squaring. "What did you do to her?" Eli asked, his voice trembling, but louder now. The man raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Her," he said casually. "Oh." He stepped closer to Eli, so close now that Eli could feel the chill radiating from him. "You're still clinging to that little fantasy," the man said softly, his voice almost kind. "She was never going to save you. She didn't even know what game she was playing." Eli felt his breath catch. Sundar took a step forward, then, placing himself subtly between Eli and the man. His voice was quiet but firm. "Where is she?" Sundar asked. The man tilted his head, studying Sundar now. "You're brave," he said, "or foolish. Do you really think you can protect him?" Sundar didn't flinch. "Where is she?" he repeated. The man's smile faded, replaced by something colder. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it carelessly onto the table in front of Eli. "She's where she belongs," the man said flatly, "and if you care about her, you'll stop digging." Eli stared at the envelope for a long moment before his trembling fingers reached out to open it. Inside was a single photograph, Clara, sitting on a bench in what looked like a park. But there was something wrong about the picture. Her hair was longer, her clothes unfamiliar, and her eyes were empty, staring at the ground like she didn't see anything at all. Eli's chest tightened so painfully it felt like his ribs might crack. He turned the photo over, and on the back was scrawled a single sentence. "She's safe as long as you stay gone." Eli's hands shook. His vision blurred as he gripped the photo tightly, feeling it crumple slightly in his fist. He whispered, his voice hoarse. The man leaned closer, his breath icy against Eli's cheek. "You don't get to win," he murmured. "Not this time. Not ever." Sundar spoke then, his voice sharp and clear. "You've made your point. Now leave." The man straightened slowly, smoothing his suit jacket. He gave Sundar a long, amused look. "You're making a dangerous choice," he said softly. "He's not worth what this will cost you." Sundar didn't blink. "That's not your decision." The man chuckled under his breath and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he paused and glanced back at Eli one last time. "Remember," he said lightly, "the more you dig, the deeper she goes." Then he was gone. The sound of the door closing behind him, leaving a silence so sharp it hurt. For a long time, neither Sundar nor Eli moved. Eli stared at the photo in his hands, his shoulders shaking, his breath uneven. Sundar finally placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," Sundar said quietly. Eli looked up at him, his eyes raw with grief and rage. "But if I don't," he whispered, "she disappears forever." Sundar nodded slightly, his expression calm but resolute. "Then we don't stop." Eli's grip on the photo tightened. "But how?" he asked, his voice breaking. Sundar straightened, his eyes narrowing with focus. "We find out where that picture was taken. We find out who's watching her. And then," his voice trailed off for a moment, but there was steel behind it when he finished. "Then we bring her back." Eli stared at him, a mix of disbelief and hope flickering in his eyes. "Do you really think we can?" Sundar's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I don't think," he said softly. "I know." Just then, Sundar's phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered quickly, his expression shifting as he listened. His eyes darkened slightly. When he asked into the phone, a pause. Then, "We'll be there." He hung up and looked at Eli, his voice calm but urgent now. "Someone just sent me an address. Said if we want answers, we meet them there tonight." Eli's stomach turned. Sundar shook his head. "They wouldn't say what if it's a trap?" Eli asked quietly. Sundar's gaze stayed steady. "Then we walk into it anyway." The sun outside was slipping below the horizon now, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. The room around them seemed to grow darker with every passing minute. "Pack whatever you need," Sundar said, already heading for the door. "We leave in 20 minutes. Eli stood there for a moment, clutching the photograph, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. But then he straightened, slid the photo into his pocket, and followed Sundar into the gathering night. They drove in silence at first, the city lights flashing past the windows, the streets growing narrower and emptier as they moved deeper into the outskirts. Eli stared out at the darkened houses, his mind churning with memories of Clara, of the way she used to smile at him like he was still worth saving. By finally, Sundar spoke, his eyes fixed on the road. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, "you don't look away." Eli nodded faintly, his hands gripping his knees. The car came to a stop outside an abandoned warehouse, its windows dark and broken, its doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. The air was heavy with the scent of rust and rain. Sundar turned off the engine, the sudden silence pressing in around them. He glanced at Eli, his expression calm but fierce. "Ready?" he asked. Eli swallowed hard, but his voice was steady when he answered, "Ready?" They stepped out of the car, their footsteps echoing against the cracked concrete as they approached the warehouse. The door creaked loudly as Sundar pushed it open, revealing a vast shadowed space inside. And there, in the center of the room, stood a single figure. Waiting for them as they stepped closer. The figure raised its head, and Eli felt the blood drain from his face, because it wasn't a stranger, it was Clara, and her eyes wide, dark, and unrecognizing stared right through him. The Choiceth warehouse was silent, except for the faint hum of a single hanging light bulb swaying gently above them. The light fell unevenly across the floor, revealing old stains and scattered debris. In the center of the room, Clara stood motionless, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her head tilted slightly, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Her hair was longer now, darker, her cheeks pale under the harsh glow, but it was her eyes that stopped Eli, cold, wide, and unblinking, but empty, like the light behind them had been switched off. Eli froze just a few feet away, his breath catching in his throat. The photo in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, hotter, as though burning through the fabric. Sundar stood beside him, silent, his gaze sharp and calculating as he scanned the room. "Clara," Eli whispered finally, his voice cracking, breaking the heavy quiet.